You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by Home Field Apparel.
Welcome back to CrimsonCast. Galen Clavio, Scott Caulfield joining you. It is Monday, the February 24th, or Monday, February 24th. I'm not sure why we needed a V in that. But whatever date it happens to be, it's a proper day. Indiana just waxed Purdue at Assembly Hall. We're going to talk about that. We're going to continue to look at coaching candidates, which always feels awkward, Scott. It's like, hey, we just had a big win. Now let's look at the replacement coach. This is such a strange pathway that we're on right now. I think for the best, I think pretty much everybody would acknowledge. But it is still just kind of odd to reconcile, like, we're going to celebrate IU's win, talk a little bit about what went into that, but also like, well, okay, let's figure out what the next regime is going to be. It's been a weird season.
Yes, indeed. But this is why IU made that announcement, is like, we can celebrate the wins now, because had we not known this was going to happen at the end of the year, it would have been a weird backdrop of people like rooting for losses and things. And now it's just like, hey, let's get in and let's make it run. I mean, I was thinking, I don't think this team has it in them, but there is a weird, if this team does make a run, like a real run, and you're like, what do we do? But I think we still hold the course. But you get to a point where it's like, at what point does the run end where you're like, do we like Sweet 16, Elite 8? Or you're like, wow, what are we doing?
I don't know. I mean, the last four games are easier than what Indiana's had to face, which we can talk about here in a minute. But
or maybe we just play Purdue every round in the tournament to see if we can line that up.
But look, we talked about it as the best possible outcome that could happen, given the one time that IU did something like this where it was announced early, and that Mike Davis team in 05-06 did end up playing better down the stretch, got to the second round of the NCAA tournament. So I think the outcome's the same there regardless. But look, a lot of it is this team's always had the talent to play at this level, and it was really interesting some of the things that happened lineup-wise yesterday. We'll talk about that in a minute. But first of all, just a reminder, we're brought to you by Home Field Apparel, your place to go for the finest in college fashions, softest fabrics, coolest designs. And, man, I tell you what, every time I go to an IU game, you're blown away by the amount of Home Field Apparel that you see. And I was out a bunch yesterday in Bloomington, was at the upstairs pub, was at Assembly Hall, was back at the upstairs pub. It's like Home Field City, which it's like an ecumenopolis of home field gear. And thank you. I'm thrilled that so many people have bought from Home Field Apparel and have found things that they want to wear with pride. And it really is like roulette now, Scott. I have to pick something when I go out and, hope that it's just far enough away from what other people are wearing that I don't look like we're all just wearing the same thing. You and I have had this problem with the Bison hoodie before. I'm sure Home Field would like everybody to wear the exact same thing every day, but I like to keep the variety going.
It's the Spider-Man meme in real life. We're all just like pointing and seeing, and like, you're just all wearing it's like in the future, everyone is wearing like the weird jumpsuit with like no buttons and no zippers. Like they just didn't know it was all going to be Home Field. Like, so Home Field may be sponsoring the future, and we're hearing it already.
Use the code HOME23, get 15% off your first order at Home Field Apparel, and that works if you're an IU fan, if you're a Purdue fan who's hate listening to this episode. You've got a lot of options, regardless of who you root for, and you can also pick up some fun apparel from teams that you don't root for, but just that looks cool, because that's important too. Again, homefieldapparel.com, proud sponsor of the Back Home Network. Speaking of the Back Home Network, you should get us on YouTube. Go ahead and subscribe. Head to YouTube, search for Back Home Network, join the over 7,100 subscribers there. You can also join us on Substack, which is free to sign up for. There was some disputes about this on Twitter for whatever reason. You subscribe to the Substack, we send you the podcast directly to your inbox, and you can comment on the shows on the Substack app, which a lot of people choose to do. We do have a paid option if you want to support the podcast. There's a little bit of extra material there. I recorded some thoughts on the coaching search yesterday. That was a paid VIP post. And just a thank you to those of you who have chosen to help the podcast out financially.
I should say you're underselling it. I mean, you have inside info, and you went ahead and announced the new coach. So I mean, VIPs get it. I mean, it's just if you want to sign up and you want to know. No, I'm totally kidding. It was just your thoughts. It'd be funny if like, hey, VIPs, like we actually have Dolson on, who's given his ideas from the coaching search.
Scott did not read the language about false advertising before doing that. So I'm
kidding. It was a good view of like putting expectations in a good reset. It was a good VIP. But
there you go. So anyway, CrimsonCast.substack.com. We'd love to have you as part of that audience. All right, let's talk about the IU Purdue game, and then we'll go in and talk about our coaching candidates. We've got 4 teed up for today that have been in the news or at least have been bandied about as potential possibilities.
Well, just like in the game, I just got to jump in. It's like we've had so many runs this season, and like this team is a thing of runs, and like this game was like a total hold my beer. We're gonna have some run. We're gonna have 2 massive runs. Like it's wild.
Yeah, this was kind of it was among the most representative of the frustrated parts of the IU fan base, but also what's made the season, kind of interesting. You can look at IU in 2 different ways. You could say Indiana's lost 8 of their last 11 games, or you can say, well, Indiana's won 2 of their last 3. Including a road game at the team that's likely going to be the 1 seed in the Big Ten tournament, and a home game by 15 over a team that up until recently was leading the conference. And so, look, this team is just a conundrum. They're an enigma in so many ways. We're not quite to wrapped in a riddle. Wrapped in a riddle would be if they lose at home to Penn State on Wednesday. So I'm holding out on that. But if you look at the runs in this game, I was talking about this on Twitter yesterday, and I said I can't remember the last time an IU game had a situation where IU gave up an 18-2 run, and then followed that up with a 28-3 run of their own. Now, we did have someone mention this, and I thought it was a really great poll. This was IU Robert Holbrook on Twitter, who noted, I haven't seen something like that since that road game against Michigan in 2016, and he was right. That game was nuts. That game, Indiana, it was a similar kind of thing. Indiana started and just looked terrible. Michigan went on a 15-2 run in that game, and then Indiana came out and did a 32-3 run, almost exactly the same numbers. And that was I remember that game very clearly. We kept waiting for the other shoe to drop with that 2016 team. Like, well, eventually they're going to lose, and they're going to lose the plot. And that was the game where it was like, maybe they won't. Maybe they will keep this going. The Purdue game yesterday was a little bit different. It wasn't totally out of left field that Indiana would play well. They played well up in West Lafayette. I think the frustrating thing in this game was, they start with 1 big. Omar Ballo is benched. Mackenzie Mbako is benched. They go with I hesitate to call it a 3-guard lineup because it's really like Miles Rice and then Trey Galloway, Anthony Look Goody, and then Malik Renew. But that lineup looked really good. Then the subs started. The 2 big lineup comes in. Purdue goes on a run. And you got to halftime, Scott, and it just was kind of like, I'm not anticipating much from this second half, but we'll see. How surprised were you at how IU looked in that second half coming out of the gates? Like, it looked like a completely different team.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is the frustrating thing with IU this season is they came out with intensity. They were playing great defense. Their offense was on par, but it was like, it was all working together. And it was really the defensive intensity that really what stood out to me. And that led to a lot of fast break points. You really got, Braden Smith and Purdue really looked flummoxed. You had them kind of on their heels. Yeah. And, it's something that I had heard somewhere else a couple days ago that, up until that point, when you watch IU basketball, a lot of times guys on defense, 1 or 2 will be in a defensive stance for the ones on the ball, but you kind of look on the wings and guys aren't really locked in, or they're in kind of a stand-up mode, not in defensive mode. That wasn't the case. I mean, everyone was 100% locked in. And I'm past the point of like, I'm frustrated with why can't we do this all the time, and just being happy. Like, hey, we did it, and we did it at the right time. And, I'm actually impressed with that, but also impressed that after the 28-3 run, it was 55-42. Purdue's kind of chipping away, gets it like 62-51. They get to, within 10 points, 5 minutes to go, and Indiana holds them off and never really gets to a point where it can get to a close end of game situation. So, I also give them double credit for that they were able to kind of put Purdue away as well, because Purdue didn't just give up at that point. They were fighting back.
Yeah, there's been a couple of interesting statistical trends that really, kind of have exclamation points in them from this game with how Indiana's played. One of the things we talked about a bunch earlier on in the season was that, Indiana had several games where they were struggling with turnovers offensively. And this was one of those games where the exact opposite happened. Indiana only turns the ball over on 11% of possessions. We've obviously had now several games where Indiana has not shot well from three. What's been fascinating is it hasn't mattered. They only went 3 for 13 from three at Michigan State, and they won that game. They only go 4 for 19 from three and were 1 for 11 from three in the first half. But it didn't matter because they went 24 for 35 from two in this game, which is, I believe, if it's not their best shooting percentage of the season from two, it's right up there. I mean, they shot 68.6% from inside the arc. The keys in this one for me were a couple of things. A, the defensive pressure, which you mentioned earlier. I was legitimately surprised at how flummoxed Purdue got by the pressure Indiana was putting on them, to the point that I was like, is there something wrong with Purdue? Like what happened to them? Because surely, and I'll be frank, I haven't watched that many Purdue basketball games this year, but that can't be the first time that someone thought to pressure Purdue's guards, but they were unable to handle it. They turned the ball over 16 times, a quarter of their possessions. Braden Smith ends up turning the ball over 6 times to only 5 assists, and he was essentially out of his game offensively the entire game.
You just didn't look at the jerseys or the rankings or the records. You would be like, oh, well, this is like, it's too bad that team in black is just not, they don't have the athletes to compete with the team in white. And it's like, that's not, to your point, like Purdue isn't the most athletic team in the Big Ten, but they are very well disciplined. And to see them like that, I also had the exact same thought. Like, why isn't everyone else able to do this to them? Like, what are we doing that they're not able to figure out? Because they played a lot of teams that are, more athletic, and they don't look like this.
You look at what Indiana did. The other really impressive thing is they did this whole game with essentially just 6 guys playing.
Right.
Kanan Carlisle was really ineffective in the 7 minutes he was out there. Mackenzie Mbako didn't start. He played a little bit in the first half, and it was clear he just wasn't really doing much defensively. And he got 3 shots up total, missed all of them. And Mike Woodson and his staff were like, all right, well, we'll just play everybody else. And everybody else was the starters plus Omar Ballo. And they all contributed really positively. I mean, you look across the board, and Trey Galloway got the MVP on Ken Pom, and he deserved it. 15 points, 9 assists, 4 rebounds. He was really the straw that was stirring the drink out there a lot in terms of the actual offensive flow. Miles Rice had one of his better games in an IU uniform, not so much in terms of the shooting, although it was interesting watching him. He was doing the thing that has been a problem with Miles Rice so far in the Big Ten season, which early in the game, he was taking pull-up jumpers, and they weren't working. And then he started just driving to the basket or looking to pass, and he didn't get a lot of assists out of that, but he did get a lot of offensive movement that led to assists on baskets. But his big contribution, obviously, was defensively, as he picks up 3 steals and really was a pain in the ass to those Purdue guards. Malik Renew had one of his better games, went over the 1,000-point mark in an IU uniform, so congratulations to Malik. 15 points, perfect from the field, 6 rebounds, 4 assists. I mean, that's the Malik Renew that you needed. And it was interesting, like in the second half especially, rarely, if ever, were he and Ballo on the floor at the same time. And you saw kind of what this roster can do with one big that's operating almost like a point forward and distributing the ball around. It opened up so many spaces. The thing I think I was the most shocked by, Scott, was like how easily Indiana was getting to the basket on a lot of their drives, because Purdue didn't seem to have a clear sense of how to handle the spacing, and their bigs kept getting into foul trouble.
Yeah, no, it's true. And I go back to, the 6 people played, and something we talked about earlier is, the minutes on Ballo. Ballo only played 22 minutes. So you kind of had a good minute wide, piece for Ballo there. I would say this, I'm with you on all the offensive thing. I think it comes back to, something that you've been harping on all year is that, hey, this is not a good defensive team. Like, that's the real quiet problem with this team. When you look at like the quarter scores, so, first quarter, if you break the halves into quarters, Indiana scores in the quarters 19-6, 28-20. So outside of the 6, like they're pretty in the same range. But the difference is Purdue goes 13, 24, 3, and 18. You hold Purdue to under 0.91 points per possession. To me, it's the defense. The defense caused a lot of the offense, and that's where I agree with you. The offense was playing well, but it was the defense that really stepped up, that really stymied Purdue. And you hold them to 21 points in the second half, 3 points in the third quarter, so to speak. That's something they just haven't done all year. And you look at like effective field goal percentage, like Purdue shot 50%. I mean, they all the numbers they turned them over 24%. Just some of the best defensive numbers we've seen all year from this Indiana team.
Well, and it's funny because you look back at the Michigan State game, they did a similar thing there, but but the second quarter, so to speak, if you're going to split it up in quarters, that was when Indiana played the best in that one. They outscored Michigan State 22-9 in that second half of the first half. So this is where, though, I kind of throw my hands up and I'm like, I can't figure this IU team out. Nobody's been able to all season. They're clearly capable against top-level teams of playing at a really high level. They just don't do it consistently.
Well, maybe, Woodson's an old Knicks guy. Maybe Thibodeau called him up and he's like, dude, just play your starters. Like, play 6 guys and, maybe, I don't know, we'll get there. Like, just go for it. Like, it's possible. I mean, because that's where, like, I think I'm not sure how replicable this is when you start playing, 6 guys, 2 games, 2, 3, this is okay to do when you're coming off of 9 days of rest. When you start playing 2 or 3 games in a week, how is this going to go? I don't know. But it does feel like Woodson's like, all right, man, this is my core. He's the guy he's going to go with. The trouble with that is how does it go game after game after game? But right now, it's like this is the Thibodeau way of playing.
We'll see. I mean, like you said, they had 9 days off.
Right.
They don't have that sort of gap at any point moving forward. They've got Penn State on Wednesday. Penn State's not very good, but Penn State just beat Minnesota at Minnesota. They've got to go to Washington. They've got to go to Oregon. They're on that same trip Saturday, Tuesday. That's going to be tough. And then they come back on Saturday for senior day as they take on Ohio State. So they've got 4 games packed into the next 2.5 weeks, essentially. And it's going to be interesting to see how they play with all of that, especially going into the Big Ten tournament. But ultimately, I think this IU team, again, it's a big dice roll in terms of what you're going to get out of them on a daily basis. But they are at least proving that if they play hard and connected on defense, they can play with anybody. And that is going to make them a really interesting team to watch, I think, down the stretch. You look at the standings right now, I think Indiana is 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th in the standings. There's no 9th in the standings. 7 and 9, projected to go 9 and 11. But you look at their actual games, they're likely to go 10 and 10. Like, I have a hard time seeing them losing 2 of the next 4. Just given the quality of the opponent. If they can split that road trip, win at Washington, lose versus Oregon, win the final 2 games at home, you may be talking about being able to skip entirely the first day of the Big Ten tournament because you've gotten yourself into a better seeding possibility. Because right now, you look at the teams in the mix for Indiana. Illinois is 9 and 8, but flailing. Oregon is 9 and 8, and obviously Indiana goes up against them head to head. They have a relatively easy run out schedule wise. Nebraska's at 7 and 9, but still has to play Michigan, at Ohio State, and Iowa at home. And, Ohio State and Rutgers are just flailing as well right now. So Indiana's in a relatively good spot. And, the inconsistency is going to be hard to get your head wrapped around with this IU team. But I think we see what the ceiling can be. We also know what the floor is. And so I don't know how to project into the future with this roster. I do know that they're not going to be able to just bench Mackenzie Mbako moving forward. Can they get him to play defense so they can keep him on the floor? Or can they play opponents where they can hide him on the defensive side? And then, can they get something out of some other aspect of their bench? These are going to be the operative questions. And I agree with you, there's probably a shelf life on this because there's only so much you can get out of a core group of 6 guys. But hats off to the 6 guys that have played to the level that they've played, because we've seen that now over a few games.
Well, I don't want to belabor this point, but because everyone here is an Indiana fan, but to those national media who are like, oh, Woodson, this is why, this is why you should keep a guy like that. It's like, no, to me, this is actually why you do need to make a change. Is it's not like that, we're doing this with gimmicks or they just went out and outplayed Purdue. They didn't run, Michigan State could maybe say they ran a 2-3 zone. Like, that's a gimmick for IU, but it's even not a gimmick. It's a defensive set. but to me, it's like, why does it take getting to February 24th to figure out your team and how to run some things? So to me, it again is it's a knock on that. There's enough talent here that we shouldn't be having you go down the Big Ten standings, be like 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th. Oh, there's Indiana. Like that to me is, again, why we're making the change. So I'm not going to belabor it, but yeah.
I love it when Scott brings his own scarecrows.
No, there's national media out there.
I'm sure that there will be some commentary on that, but at this point, it doesn't matter. Is kind of how I would approach it, and so I would almost say don't even engage in that line of thinking, because again, it's like you can look at this season and coming into the Purdue game, Indiana had lost 8 of their last 10. That's not an accident. You can look at last year at this time and you can say, well, Indiana went on a 4-game winning streak to close the season out. And you can also say that's true. And they were 14-13 when they started that 4-game winning streak. So there's no imagined like nirvana of basketball that's being played that IU fans are missing. This is just a very inconsistent program right now. And that's essentially been its hallmark for the last couple of years. It really goes beyond that. So anyway, we'll see what happens with IU in terms of how all this plays out. Always good to see them, maybe kind of land the death blow against Purdue, maybe winning the Big Ten. Purdue's lost 4 in a row now.
Are you pulling back your $10 million check from Painter?
Yeah, I think so. I think he's
sorry, Matt.
He may have to earn his way back into the picture at this point. So I don't even. I'm not gonna get into Painter's comments on this podcast. The stuff he said afterwards. It's been an interesting debate, so to speak, on Twitter.
Bringing your own straw man argument to stuff.
Well, right, that was it was very weird. It was just the tenor of the comments was weird. But I'm going to tackle that, I think, on a VIP video later. Not because I don't want to hear. It's just I'm still kind of getting my head wrapped around how to analyze all of that. But we'll talk about that on another podcast. Let's instead talk about some future coach possibilities with the second half of the pod.
Before we get to the 3 we're going to do today.
Yes,
it's awards
season. We're doing 4. We added one.
Sorry. We added one. Yeah. It's awards season, so hopefully everyone can hear this. Memoriam to Dusty May. We never got to talk about him. I think it killed our mics there when I played it. But great coach. We just didn't get to talk about him. I'm sorry, Dusty. Time was too short for our time together.
I think you have to put an asterisk there, like in memoriam for Dusty May as coach, not Dusty May as a person. I mean, Dusty's alive and well.
Minutes before we did this, Dusty May is still alive. Yes, we'll.
Wow, Scott. Between
about him, it's too bad. Sorry, Justin.
Between false advertising at the start of the podcast, and now you're killing off coaches in the Big Ten. It's really a fascinating thing. Dusty May. For those who haven't seen, I'm assuming everybody's seen. Dusty May signs an extension on Friday of last week with Michigan, which extends his time there, extends his buyout. That apparently adds additional NIL money. I'll say this, and I talked about this a little bit in the video that I recorded over the weekend. It's disappointing because I think Dusty May would have been a legitimately good candidate to be the next IU coach. Obviously, has a lot of ties. But I'll also say the timing is really curious on this. The idea that Michigan, a football program, randomly extends their basketball coach and gives them more NIL money in the middle of February. Something else happened there. And so how you interpret that, I don't know. But I think a lot of IU fans will look at what Dusty May does at Michigan and always have a question in the back of their minds. I think everybody kind of will. But you also have to say that, first of all, congratulations to Dusty. And I think it's really dangerous in coaching searches to get caught in the what if game. You see that a lot. I'm like the history of when Bob Knight got hired at IU is always informative. I know people get tired when we mention Bob Knight, but I think it's important to think about it. Like Bob Knight almost took the Wisconsin job. Right. And in fact, had verbally agreed to do it and then ended up backing out because the story got leaked. Bo Schembechler famously calls him and says, don't take that job. So he doesn't. Bob Knight's dream job was Notre Dame. Notre Dame wasn't available. Indiana contacts him, hires him as head coach. And then, a week later, the Notre Dame job opens up and Digger Phelps gets that job. There's so many sliding doors moments that you can't really get yourself thinking about that. And I've heard this with Dusty May. I've heard it with Chris Beard. I've heard it with some other of these candidates, people saying, well, God, we're going to miss out on this coach that's going to do X, Y, and Z down the line. And it doesn't always really work that way. Timing is always very important in coaching. And sometimes things that look externally like great fits might not have been. So, some person having success at one school doesn't necessarily mean they would have the same success at the school you're at. I think it's fine to be disappointed with the May news, but I have to think that the way that played out and the timing of it, it just feels like he wasn't going to get the job and that was already decided upon, because I have a hard time believing, with no prompting, no need for a contract extension, given that he just started there last year, that this wasn't prompted by him making a conscious decision that he wanted to be at Michigan. So I think that's going to be an interesting thing moving forward to see, like, who does Indiana end up with, and what does it end up looking like long term in terms of how Dusty May does at Michigan? Because that's a job that you can have a lot of success at, like John Beilein did, but it can also be a job where you can be up and down, because it's not, despite its pedigree, it's not always been a basketball powerhouse.
Yeah, no, I mean, and real quickly, then we'll move on to our coaches. It's when we hired Archie and things didn't start going right, I had some times being like, man, we should have hired Holtman. Like, that was the exact same time. Like, that didn't work out either.
No.
And so you're right on the sliding doors thing. And it's also, we get into this mode where it's like, well, Dusty May was a manager here, so he must want to come coach. Like, there's a world, maybe he's like, I don't want to go there. Like, for whatever reason, like, I just don't want to be there. There's places I don't want to live. and I grew up in Bloomington. I went to IU. I live in Indianapolis. Bloomington's a little bit too small for me to live in. Nothing wrong with it. And so there's those factors at play as well. And I would also say too, this could also be, you don't know. Dusty could have just played this right and be like, hey, I'm getting mentioned. It makes a lot of sense. I'm just going to leverage the hell out of this and get a raise. Right. I'm with you. You can't get into that world of, man, if we had done this and done that, we could have gotten that guy. I mean, you can't go down those roads. You can only go with the opportunities you have available to you. And for all we know, and this is based on absolutely nothing, for all we know, part of the reason we kept Woodson was because maybe they did reach out to Dusty last year, and Dusty's like, yeah, man, I'm not really interested in going to Indiana at any point.
Right. Yeah. And there's so many things behind the scenes, as we've talked about, that we don't know. So I just wouldn't get too freaked out about it one way or the other. Of course, I think many people already did, and they perceived it as, well, the IU job must not be attractive. I don't think that's what you take out of that. Let's talk about some other candidates, though, in the time that we've got remaining on this podcast. A name that popped up at the end.
This is the connection category. I'm going to call it. So last time was the slow pace category. These are all guys who are either connected to Iowa State or connected to former places, connected to former places we got coaches, or connected to places where brothers of places that we got coaches from coach. So it's a connection group. I'm
not sure you needed to name this. I'll just say that. You probably could have, never mind. But let's talk about TJ Otzelberger first. This was a name that popped up in a Field of 68 podcast. Jeff Goodman putting Otzelberger forward as a candidate. So it's an interesting situation with TJ Otzelberger. Let's go over his background. For those of you who are watching along, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get to his KenPom page so that we can all look at this together. Let me zoom this in for everybody. But if you look at Otzelberger, he's been a head coach now for about, what is this? This is his 9th or 10th season. And he's been at Iowa State now since 2022. He's been very successful at Iowa State so far. 22 wins, 19 wins, 29 wins, and then this year, 21-6 thus far. This is a coach, you can say, who's really coalesced around a defensive identity. 4 straight years now, 4 straight seasons at Iowa State, where they have been in the top 10 of KenPom defensive efficiency. And I think what might be the most attractive about Otzelberger is that it seems like his offensive coaching is getting a lot better. They've gone from 171st in KenPom offensive efficiency in his first year to 21st this season. You look around at some of the other metrics that are interesting. He seems to be a coach that is trying to get with the times in terms of the modernity of how his teams are playing. His teams at South Dakota State and UNLV took a ton of threes. They haven't done that at Iowa State so far. And instead, what Iowa State has really thrived on is 2-point efficiency and being just a monster defensively in terms of they're constantly turning their opponents over. I mean, the previous 3 years, they'd had a 25% or better turnover rate on defense, which is nuts. They do foul quite a bit, but, overall, 2 Sweet 16s for TJ Otzelberger. And, it feels like just a load of potential with this guy. He'll be 48 at the start of the next season. He's got a 689 win percentage, a 646 win percentage in the conference, and already won 2 conference titles with the Summit League. I don't know. I mean, the big thing with Otzelberger, Scott, is I don't understand the contract situation with him. So he's gotten 2 consecutive extensions from Iowa State, one in April of 23, where his contract amount isn't that much. I think it's like in the $2.5 to $3 million range. But that contract had a buyout that was the entire length of the remaining contract. So it was like an $18 to $20 million buyout. Now, Jeff Goodman in the podcast that he did on Friday noted that Otzelberger had renegotiated his buyout down to $4 million, which I don't understand why Iowa State would do that, because they had this guy locked up and basically not going anywhere. And so now he's got more money, but hypothetically a lower buyout, but there's been nothing actually published about what the contract terms are, despite the extension having been announced in December. So I'm all confused about TJ Otzelberger as an actual potential candidate, but certainly from the numbers, Scott, I think he's a guy you would really be excited about if he came to IU.
I'm just laughing because as we were prepping for this, I was trying to Google like what's his buyout, and it's just like it doesn't come in. Like I need to go to the dark web for that. Like it's a very hard number to find, so I'm laughing at that. No, he's kind of in that perfect spot of, in a couple of podcasts ago we talked about where do coaches come from, and you look at the best coaches, and most of the best coaches in the country kind of came from anonymity or just very small beginnings, and that's what you saw at South Dakota State, UNLV. But then it's like you get a taste of what it looks like at the big level with Iowa State, but not, 20 years of experience like we saw with like Scott Drew. So the thing that I like is, he was working on the defensive stuff, but when he got to Iowa State, in the 4 years he's there, the adjusted defense rank in the country was 5th, 8th, 1st, and 9th. That's nice. But what I really like is his offensive efficiency went from 171st to 114th to 52nd to 9th. So you see that he's like, all right, I know how to do defense. Like I got that on the side. And as opposed to like kind of like the Archie mold, where like I'm going to focus on more pack line defense and more defense, and someone else can figure out offense. It does feel like it's like, all right, I can now work on molding an offense to go with this good defense. And now he's in that range that we always talk about, being in the top 25 of both adjusted offense and defense. This year they're 21st and 9th in offense and defense respectively. And that's the hallmarker of a team that gets to a Final Four and wins a title. Like those are things that you see there. Now, how this season goes, I think is also, it is something that does come up. So I'm with you. If the buyout's there, it seems like he's a really good candidate. The other thing that you've mentioned before too, that again, this is probably we'll keep, promoting other podcasts. We should probably do another podcast on this, or you should, the idea of, the payouts, not the NIL payouts, but the revenue sharing.
Right.
If you're in the Big 12, what's Iowa State's commitment going to be to revenue share? Where Indiana's already said they're going to take whatever half the Big 10 is and go double that. So like Indiana's been like, hey, we're going to have revenue sharing money. We're going to have NIL sharing money. We're going to have all the money that you need. What does that look like at Iowa State? There's that piece that also I think he needs to look at.
Yeah.
But also, this is just a real thing. If they make a run this year, like let's just say he gets Iowa State to a Final Four or an Elite Eight, I can't think of a lot of coaches who went to a Final Four and then left that off season. Like,
right.
Dusty May left the year after, Chris Beer the year after. Like you can leave a year or two after. I'm not saying it's impossible, but that would be very unprecedented if they go to a Final Four or a final game, just also be like, hey, deuces on my new contract. Like I'm going to go out. So I do wonder, there's almost a sweet spot of how good they can do in the tournament to make him a viable candidate for Indiana.
Yeah, no, you're right. I agree with that. I think, look, even if they crashed out in the second round, I think that'd be great. That would be helpful. I'm of two minds here. Like the fact that I don't think Goodman's trying to get him a new contract. You do see that with journalists sometimes where they'll push their friends or people that they're professionally friendly with. I don't think that's happening here because he just got a new contract on top of another new contract. Like there's only so many new contracts that you could get. Is he actually interested in the job? I think maybe. He's not an Iowa native. He's a Wisconsin native. He was from Milwaukee, went to Wisconsin Whitewater. People have brought up, well, he's married to an Iowa State basketball legend. That's true, but she's not from Iowa. She's from Australia. So I doubt that there are like deep-seated roots in Ames for either of these folks. I think they probably like it there. And look, Iowa State's always like the one of the programs I'm the least worried about rooting for. You know, they're like a fun team to follow in both football and basketball because they're a team that almost always punches above their weight. Kansas State kind of falls into the same category. The thing about Iowa State, and I'm glad you brought this up because it's something you really need to think about with some of these coaches like Scott Drew. You know, the Big 12 is not going to be in as good a position as the Big 10 teams are, particularly Indiana, in terms of the money that they will have available for NIL, in terms of just their overall budget. I mean, just this past year, Iowa State did $114.2 million in revenue in their entire athletics program. Indiana did $175 million in revenue. And Indiana has shown a commitment to basketball funding that a lot of other schools will not. So as much as you might want to talk about the fishbowl or talk about like, well, I can win at Iowa State or I can win at, this place. Why would I come to Indiana? It is going to get progressively harder under the current landscape to win and compete with limited financial resources at Big 12 schools and things like that. And the problem with an Iowa State or a Baylor is they have to take football probably more seriously because they're going to get more revenue from that. And there's only so much pie that you can split at these places. And so that is, I think, something we really need to keep in mind. It might make
a new paradigm. I mean, it's the way, the idea of like, oh, well, Scott Drew, and maybe he'll stay at Baylor. Like maybe he will, but the idea of like, oh, he's built it there. Like why he would just, guys like that don't leave. Like, well, that's the old paradigm of the way it used to be in, 20, 30 years ago. It's like, as we talked about in one of our other pods, like the paradigm has changed. And so how schools are able to do rev share and NIL matters a lot more than what used to be real deciders in coaching decisions 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah. I think it's just something we really got to think about as we move forward. So we'll keep an eye on that. Let's jump to another coach because we have a limited amount of time this morning. But similar area, also coached Iowa State at one point. Didn't have a workout nearly as well. But we're talking about Greg McDermott, whose name I've seen pop up on several hot boards. So McDermott's an interesting case. And one of those guys where I looked at the numbers and I was like, I had no idea he'd been at Creighton for that long. Like he's been at Creighton long enough that he was coaching Creighton while they were in the Missouri Valley Conference before they joined the Big East in 2014. McDermott, over the course of his career, he's at a 631 win percentage, but he's won 67% of his games at Creighton. He has a 62 win percentage in the Big East, which is pretty impressive given that you're at Creighton, which is not a program that has the same level of financial resources as some of the other schools in the Big East, but does have more than, say, a DePaul or a Seton Hall has. One Big East title, that was in 2020. Another one of those coaches where, and we've had several of them in these podcasts, where it's like, I think the whole paradigm changes if the 2020 tournament happens, because that was probably Greg McDermott's best team or one of his best teams, and they didn't get a chance to play in the NCAA tournament that year. 12 tournaments made overall in his career, only one Elite Eight, 3 Sweet 16s. We've talked a lot about, and just TJ Otzelberger being a great example. That's a guy who's clearly got a defensive focus. Greg McDermott, you want to talk about offensive coaches, this is the guy that you're looking for.
This is the shot doctor. If you want to get the shots off, this is the shot doctor.
This is the coach offensively that people think Tom Crean is, and that's not totally fair. Crean actually reminds me a lot of McDermott in terms of like how good his teams are at shooting. You look at what they've done over the course of his time there. He's had multiple seasons where they've been in the top 5 in effective field goal percentage over the course of his period at Creighton. They are normally top 50, if not top 20 in 3-point attempt percentage, which I know is something that a lot of IU fans would enjoy. What's also interesting about him is like his teams are are fairly good defensively. Like, we talk about that sweet spot where you're top 30 offense and top 30 defense. He's had several of those throughout the course of his time where he's been in one or the other, and a few seasons where they've been that in both, including a couple of years ago when they made it to the Elite Eight, and last year when they made it to the Sweet 16. He's not as old as people think. He'll be 60 when the season starts. I will say, when I look at him, I'm a little underwhelmed, but I'm also, just in terms of like the name doesn't resonate. And you do look back at the last time he was in a different power conference at Iowa State, 4 years, never made the NCAA tournament, never even had a winning record in those 4 years, which is kind of shocking. But he's a name I think you have to at least consider, given that he has demonstrated a high level of competency. I just don't know if, when you compare him to some of the other candidates, he stacks up quite as well as you would like in terms of the criteria you want to see at IU.
Yeah, you hit on the thing that I was going to get into is like just last time he was at a power conference at Iowa State, his teams went 15-16, 14-18, 15-17, 15-17. So, but that was also a different landscape. Like that was 2007 to 2010. At Creighton, it's this run from 2015 to 2019 that really sticks out. When in that stretch, they only make the tournament 2 out of 5 years, and both those years they go out in the first round. What I was trying to figure out in the stats is what changed in those eras, because he starts at Creighton. They go, they win basically 20 games a year for 4 or 5 years. They make the second round of the tournament 3 years in a row. And then in the last couple of years, they've, won 20 games. In the last, 5, 6 years, they've been to the Elite Eight, Sweet 16. The only thing I could find that was different is the first 4 years of Creighton, when they were kind of humming, they were really bad at turning teams over. Like they were like the worst team in the country at turning teams over. And then in this 6-year stretch, they got really better, like one of the top half teams of getting turnovers on defense, and they kind of went away from it. So I don't think this is it, but I wonder if that was like focusing too much their defense on getting turnovers. And it's like, let's just forget turnovers and just turn into an offensive juggernaut. And it's like he figured it out again. But I think you hit the perfect word. It's just underwhelming. I think he would come here. He has a system. But you look at what he's done at Creighton, there hasn't been those, I guess, the one Elite Eight, but there hasn't been those high level pops and just the long-term consistency. Unfortunately, as I'm saying this, it reminds me a little bit of Crean. Like there's some pops and then there's some valleys, and we know that that's not as much fun as it looks. I mean, I guess I'd enjoy some pops at this point, but those 2 to 3 year valleys of not making the tournament is kind of what get you in a lot of trouble at a place like Indiana.
Yeah, and look, Creighton is a harder place to win. It's a private school in Omaha, and all of its conference foes are, at least 300 miles away, if not significantly further.
Kids, I think, no more Doug McDermott.
No more Doug McDermott. That's right. Yeah, he's run out of them after a while. So
he's like, shit, I'm out of kids.
But there is a lot of Crean DNA. It feels like in the way they play, and that they're very non-pressured defensively. They don't foul, which I think is really interesting, at least this season. But it is interesting looking at this season. All they're doing is shooting offensively, and that is a bit of a red flag. So we did. You know what? I want to get your number for him.
Oh yeah, we forgot.
We forgot the number for Otzelberger. So what would be your number on 0 to 100 excitement wise if this is the higher?
McDermott, probably like 67.
Okay.
Because I know we talked about it doesn't matter, but I would feel like, man, this can't have been the number one option from February 2nd of like, we're going to do nothing but go after Greg McDermott.
Yeah.
It would have felt like we missed on a couple of things. It would also feel like, all right, this is somebody who can probably right the ship. But I would be, what would make me optimistic about it is I do feel like, all right, he could probably get us onto a path where, we're focused and ready to go. And it also doesn't feel like he, is going to have, I don't know, like may not try and take over the program. Like I think he maybe would understand like this is a 7-year process, take it over. I don't know, but I would feel like at least we're in kind of safe hands, but we may not have the upper level eliteness that I would want.
I think I would be hypocritical if I ranked him any higher than Mick Cronin, given that Mick Cronin has had more success and is younger. It's just that I would prefer to watch a Greg McDermott coach basketball team. So I'm going to have to rank. I think I had, whatever my Cronin number was, I think it was like 62 or 61. I think that's got to be my McDermott number, just because like the things I like and the things that I don't like kind of balance each other out with him, but it's the same equation ultimately. The one difference is Mick Cronin sounds like he whines a bunch, and I don't really want to listen to that, and I've yet to detect that from Greg McDermott. But I feel like ultimately as a choice, they're kind of in the same zip code.
Great code. Great
so what was your Otzelberger number?
Man, it would be high. I mean, the numbers look really good. If you can get out of well, first off, it'd be awesome to know what the buyout is. Like at that point, we would know because we would be paying it.
Well, given it's not our money, technically, it's some donor's money. Don't worry about that.
Yeah, no, I'm saying it'd be fun to know. Like right now, we have no idea what it just be. He's the top of my list right now. I mean, I think he would be a really high. I'd put him, like mid 80s. I mean, 80.
Do you put him above Scott Drew?
That's a great question. I would have them kind of together, honestly. I'd probably have Drew a little bit ahead just because Drew has shown that he can. I mean, he's won a title. Certainly take a minute. Like he's shown that ability to really build it. But the thing with Otzelberger is it would be hard for me to learn his name, so that would be tough. I'd have to figure that one out.
Yes.
But secondly, there is a little bit more of a runway there, and if he really figures, if his profile turns into what we think he could be, it's like this could be, man, you are on the ride for 20 years. Like you just. We made up for 20 years of being in the wilderness to we nailed the hire and we got it right if it works out. And that is really, that's why the NBA draft and drafts are so much fun, is because it's more fun to look at the potential than the reality. So I would probably have him 2 or 3 points higher. So I'd be like at 87 or 88, but it's just based on that potential and the age thing, which don't always turn out to be anything. So that was where I would be.
I would have him like a quarter notch below Drew. I just, given Drew's Indiana ties, the fact he's won a title, the fact here's the one thing, like, I think it's so much harder to win in basketball consistently at Baylor than it is at Iowa State. I mean, you look at the history of Iowa State. Iowa State's had some really good coaches. They've had seasons where they've been very prominent. They've won with a bunch of different types of coaches. So, it's clearly a little bit easier to win because there's a little more of a commitment to basketball at Iowa State. But I think both would be great. I just would have Drew just slightly higher. So if I don't remember what my Drew number was, it was like maybe 88 or 89. I would have Otzelberger at like a 80 or an 81. Just because I think there's a lot of potential there, as you said. I just don't know how it plays out with everything else. Let's get to our third one, and this is not one I think we're going to spend a tremendous amount of time on, but the name keeps coming up, so we're going to talk about him, and it's Buzz Williams. Buzz Williams, I think, clearly.
I just want to start with this. You normally do a good job of laying. I just want to start with this. Why does he keep leaving places? Like,
right.
I was reading, I wasn't deep into it, but it's like he does well at Marquette, then he's out. Like one bad year, but then he's out. And it seems like he's out on his own accord. He's doing well at Virginia Tech. He's like, I'm out. Going to Texas A&M. Like he goes through these lateral moves. So I don't mean to jump the process. I'm just like, that's the biggest question I have with him.
Well, so I think there's some explanations for why he's been jumping, but I also think that to some degree he's got a shelf life. He knows he has a shelf life. Well, you'll hear a lot from coaches like, what you really need to do is be at a place for 5 or 6 years, do what you can do, and then you either jump or you to a higher job, right, or you jump for other reasons. And
he's doing that.
You do. No, so I think part of what you have to keep in mind is like, I think the perception of going from a Big East in 2014 that's future was still a bit cloudy from a revenue perspective to an ACC school made a lot of sense. So he goes from Marquette to Virginia Tech, has more success at Virginia Tech than, say, Seth Greenberg had. And Virginia Tech's not the easiest place to win at, but then he's from Texas originally. The Texas A&M job opens up. They've got more money than God. So I think that's a justifiable move from his perspective, but it does look a little bit odd. I agree. The thing with Buzz Williams that I think is worth noting is that he's just not really done anything truly outstanding in his entire career. He's got a .623 win percentage in the course of his career. He's only 53 years old. Like, he's a really young coach, relatively speaking. But in that whole time, having coached all the way back to 2007, he's got one Elite Eight in the entire time, and that was in 2013. So we are 12 years past his last Elite Eight, only 3 Sweet 16s. In the 5 years that he coached in the ACC, he had a .489 conference win percentage. And in the SEC so far, he's only got a 56% win percentage in conference games. And the other thing, Scott, and we'll call up his KenPom page here. The other thing about him that I just find bizarre is how much of a chameleon he has been in terms of how his teams have played.
Yeah.
So if you go back and look at his Marquette days, they were a pretty consistent team in that they were generally a top 25 offensive team, and then they were a bit worse defensively in each of those years. Very similar to how Crean, who he coached under at Marquette and replaced, when Crean left for IU, that's basically how Crean's teams play. He goes to Virginia Tech, and it takes him a while, but they become a pretty good offensive team by the time that he's done there, and they really do well in shooting and are not very good in rebounding. He gets to Texas A&M and has gone the entirely opposite direction, where his teams are among the worst shooting teams in college basketball, but they are the best at getting offensive rebounds. And so he's got it's a little bit reminiscent of Scott Drew, but without the high-end success and without the consistency over a long period of time. I mean, to some degree, it's like you like a coach that can be a bit of a chameleon in terms of what they do. But on the other hand, when you combine the lack of a footprint, like a clear footprint for Buzz Williams' teams, with the lack of tournament success, it's like, I don't know if he's ever going to hit on a formula that will actually make him more than a second-tier coach. And that's really not the direction Indiana needs to go with this hire.
No, you've hit on exactly the things that I was looking at. Is that normally when you look at keep the KenPom page up if you don't mind. When you look at a KenPom page, you can kind of get a feel for what a coach is. And I think this goes into recruiting. So that was always our thing with Crean, is it felt like he was just recruiting everybody. And like, what was the plan? Like, what is your target guy? With Williams, you look at the adjusted tempo. We joked last time they were all slow tempo guys. With Williams, at one point in Marquette, they're one of the fastest teams in the country, 15th in the 2012 season. He gets to Virginia Tech. They're kind of going faster and faster throughout his time at Virginia Tech. But then his last year is his best year. It's the only team that kind of meets that criteria of adjusted offense and defense in the top 25. But yet they're the slowest he's ever played a team. So it's like all of a sudden you just go from 142nd in pace to 334th, and he finds a formula. So he goes to A&M. It's like, all right, this is the formula I'm going to use. They go 16-14, 8-10. It's like, this isn't working. And then the next year, they're back to kind of playing mid-pace. So to your point, you look at his page and you just don't know, like, what is the hallmark of a Buzz Williams team? Because it looks like the hallmark is change. Like, whatever's not working, we're going to change it, which I agree. Like, that is a good thing. You don't want to get too dug into it. But for a coach who has, 15 plus years experience, there should be something where you look at it. It's like, all right, well, obviously he focuses on this. And you can see that with like Scott Drew, numbers get better throughout time with, TJ Otzelberger, even just in his time, you see, okay, he gets to a place, he's going to get defense figured out. And now he's working on offense. So I think I agree with you. That's the thing with Buzz Williams is I'm not sure what system he's going to bring in. It feels like he'd come in and be like, all right, what do we have? All right, here's what we're going to run. And it's like, that's Indiana needs somebody who comes into it and is going to be like, this is the program I'm going to run. And not to mention, this is the profile of a coach. No one's willingly left IU in our lifetime. This is the profile of a coach who feels like he could do that.
Yeah. The last thing I'll say, because I do want to get to our last one, I think all those are great points, is, excluding this season where his team's already got 7 losses, the last time he had a single-digit loss season was in 2019 at Virginia Tech. Yeah. And then the last time before that was in 2013 at Marquette, and he had 9 losses in both of those seasons. Like, this is a guy who most of his seasons at double-digit losses, which kind of goes back to the second-tier idea that I talked about earlier. So
I'd be like a 54 on Buzz Williams. I would not be happy with this.
I'd be about a 30, if that. I mean, I would almost rather have Brad Brownell than Buzz Williams. So not quite, but almost. Anyway, last one we wanted to get to. This is a relatively short one, but we want to talk about Tommy Lloyd, which is a name that's come up a little bit. Now, I don't really think Tommy Lloyd is an actual candidate, but I do think he's worth mentioning, if for no other reason than he fits another archetype that IU hasn't considered, which is longtime assistant coach becoming a head coach. So Tommy Lloyd was a 21-year assistant at Gonzaga, kind of Mark Few's right-hand man, big in the international scene, just recently became the United States under-19 men's basketball coach, which I think is a big thing. You look at what he's done at Arizona, he's at Arizona in the essentially the top 10 of Ken
He's got a
Pom
profile.
all 3 years.
Yeah.
He plays one of the fastest tempos in the country consistently. He's got one of the most efficient offenses in the country. In the last 2 years, he's had a really hyper efficient defense as well. 10th last year, 18th so far this year. His teams love to pass the ball. They are, in the top 50 in assist rate. They're great at shooting. They've been great from three, not so much this year, and that to some degree is why they're not performing as well, but they're also playing tougher competition. But the fact that they're 12th in Ken Pom, jumping to what is frankly a much harder basketball conference from the Pac-12 to the Big 12, I really like this profile. I do worry a little bit in terms of he clearly can get top-end talent, good athletic talent. I don't know how that's going to work in terms of practice, but already in 3 years plus, he's got 2 Sweet 16s and is winning at a really impressive clip overall. I mean, his overall win percentage is .785 through the course of his first 3 3/4 years as a college basketball coach. So you have to at least look at it. I don't think he would ever leave. Why would he leave Arizona other than the revenue to come to Indiana? But I do think he's worth a look given the statistical performance he's had at a place that's not an automatic win. I mean, if you look at Arizona, obviously Sean Miller had his own set of problems, but he's winning at a rate that is, I think, better or at least as good. And certainly he's got them ranked at a level that's been better than what Sean Miller had at Arizona. So it's just an interesting combination of things to think about.
Yeah, it's not for me to say why he would leave. Maybe it is the rev share, but the stats look awesome. I mean, a hyper fast offense, but also having a really good defense is really good. It's really interesting. And I like that. I mean, the thing, it's a very small sample size, so it's not totally fair, but we did this on one of the other candidates, looking at how they did in the tournament, because he's had really good teams. I mean, all of his teams have met that profile of a team that can go to the Final Four. So you got to ask why. Again, a small sample size. But, in 2022, they were the 1 seed. They lost the 2 seed. So, losing to a lower seed, but, 12 points, losing to Houston. It's not the end of the world. 2023, not awesome. You lose to Princeton in the first round as a 2 seed. Again, it's a small sample size, but unfortunately, then it matters that you lost in the first round as a 2 seed. And then in 2024, last year, again, connections, they're the 2 seed. They lose in the third, the Sweet 16 to Clemson, coached by Purdue.
Yes.
And they lose by 5 points. Not great. That's the only thing you could say is he hasn't totally cashed in, but it's also a really small sample size. I mean, I don't think that's it's unfortunately that 2023 year. If they would have gone another Sweet 16, you just be like, all right, he's waiting for the right team to break through. So I wouldn't knock it. I would be very interested in this hire. I think it's a really good hire. What is his age? Because I know he's a Gonzaga.
He's young. He's very young. He would be 50 when the season starts, and his birthday is in December. So again, really young coach. Yeah, no, I mean, your point on the tournament results, you almost have to take with a grain of salt when a coach is starting their career. I mean, if you look at the way Bruce Pearl started at Auburn, similar style, similar pace, 3 straight years, no NCAA tournament. 4th year they get there and they lose in the second round, and then they make the Final Four the next year. So it's one of those things where I think everybody would take Bruce Pearl, or at least most people would, based upon what he's doing. Tommy Lloyd plays a similar kind of game. And it's not like they're bad defensively. They didn't lose that Clemson game because of some bad defensive performance per se. So it's going to be an interesting one to look at. Again, it would be an off-the-board hire in a lot of ways, just because of the, again, Arizona is still a very attractive job. It's a job where you can win a national title. But I do wonder financially, and just
rev share hire. This would really be the rev share hire and would kind of open up the eyes of all right. And I do think the Big Ten, this is one of those where, again, same as in football, Big Ten and SEC are just, they're a level above. And the revenue is going to be higher. And it's Arizona is consistently a good basketball school, but it's a Big 12 school. And it's just, again, we're moving into a different era where the economics really do matter and what conference you're in really matters.
The one thing I will say, though, is there's always this comment, do you want to move into the best house in the neighborhood or not? And so I don't know. I mean, Arizona is never going to be the best house in the Big 12 because that will always be Kansas. Kansas that's the team that's got the juice, but Arizona might be the second best job in the Big 12. So there might be a justification for staying. Indiana can be the best job in the Big Ten. It's not right now in terms of results.
Yeah, the inspection report for Indiana is like, needs a new roof, the water heating going out.
Absolutely.
The view is great. The view is awesome, but I mean, the HVAC's got a little rust in there.
Get a second opinion on that inspection report. But yes, so that's going to be something to keep in mind. But anyway, these are the things with Lloyd that I think are worth looking at. So take that and run with it. My excitement for Lloyd, though, would be about a 75. Like, it would be certainly below the two top picks so far, which would be Drew and Otzelberger. But he's right there in that next mix. And I would certainly be more excited about Tommy Lloyd than I would be about Mick Cronin or Greg McDermott.
Yeah,
so,
no, I'd have Lloyd like 79 or 80. Like, he'd be pretty close up. I think he could come in and really run an offense.
All right. On that note, we'll go ahead and run out of the podcast room. Thanks to our friends at Home Field Apparel. Thanks to our friends at the rest of the Back Home Network. Scott, thank you. As always, a pleasure. We'll be back with more podcasting later on this week as we take a look at the coaching search and where Indiana will land. And we also get ready for IU Penn State coming up on Wednesday. For Scott, I'm Galen. This is CrimsonCast. We'll catch you folks on the flip side. Bring back the Bison. Stay never daunted. So long, everybody.